Hello, so I'm Dom Camus, and this is a slightly extended version of a talk I recently gave at the Indie Games Conference 2015 in London. It's slightly extended because, although I haven't added any content, it turns out I'm really bad at being concise once I'm recording, so there's probably a slightly inferior version. But never mind, I hope you enjoy it anyway. So here's the problem with talking about puzzles. Puzzles are basically everything. Here we've got a Rubik Cube, crossword puzzle, John Blow's platform game Braid, and these have very little in common. Two of them even predate video games. So why even call things puzzles at all? Well, the trouble is this is the term people use, so we're stuck with it. So what I'm going to do is explain a little bit about what the unifying elements are of puzzles in video games and why it's worth thinking about them as a category at all. So here's the way that I'd like you to think about puzzles, which is that a puzzle is a challenge where finding the solution is hard, but once you've found that solution, implementing it is relatively easy. So if you think about, say, the case of the crossword puzzle, if I told you what all the words were and where they went in the grid, it would be a very straightforward matter for you to transcribe them all. Similarly, if I even just told you what the words were and didn't even tell you where they went, it would still be comparatively straightforward. Similarly with the Rubik's Cube, if I tell you exactly what moves to make, it may take you a while, but it will be very straightforward. Braid, interestingly, slightly less straightforward, but that's because it's not entirely a puzzle, which is something I'll come to later. So as a quick aside, I can't resist briefly mentioning some of the mathematical underpinnings of this kind of puzzle. This game, Minesweeper, you may well have played, since it used to be bundled with Windows. In fact, I think it still is, with every copy of Windows. It's a conceptually straightforward game. You're trying to guess where the mines are on this grid. They explode if you click on them. So you click everywhere else and it tells you how many are adjacent to a given square. Now interestingly, someone did an analysis of this game and showed that in fact you could build logic gates in it. So particular carefully chosen arrangements of mines, they're random if you play the game for real, but if you have particular arrangements of mines you can build a NOT gate, like in digital electronics, and an AND gate. And once you can do those two things, you can build arbitrary circuits. Why does this matter? Well, it means that the process of working out how to correctly play an arbitrary Minesweeper board is actually a horrifyingly complex process, and it's not something you can solve efficiently. So for a really large board, you'd never finish. Even a perfect strategy would presumably not finish. Now, why do I say presumably? Well, because actually this is a famous unsolved problem in mathematics. Not Minesweeper specifically, but this class of problems in general. It's a category of problem called NP-hard problems. And informally speaking, what this means is we know of efficient ways to verify when we have a solution, but we don't know of efficient ways to find a solution. And in fact, in the year 2000, this was one of the Millennium Prize problems published by the Clay Mathematics Institute, and there is still an unclaimed $1 million prize if you can come up with an efficient way to solve these problems. The bad news being that if you succeed, you've also broken all of the world's cryptographic systems, and so we're going to be in a lot of trouble. So what actually matters about all that is simply the fact that solving puzzles is not a trivial business. Hard puzzles are hard. There is no strategy that will get us through every puzzle. Now, back to the world of games. What we have here is the list of genres in Steam, the digital download service, and this makes me very sad. There's no puzzle games here. What's going on? Why are there no puzzles? Well, there's a number of possible reasons for this. One is, you might say, well, puzzles are a niche thing, nobody plays them. I think that's actually not true. Easily enough gamers are interested in puzzles or will play puzzles occasionally that they could justify their place here. Another possibility is that puzzles are in all of these categories, sort of spread out. There's some truth in that, but actually, aside from the indie category, it's again not really the case. I think the main reason is the games on Steam are still, by and large, fairly large commercial games. They're the kind of game where you pay some upfront fee in order to be able to play, and then download it to your machines or whatever. Puzzle games actually seem to thrive in the kinds of arena where you get smaller games. So you get more of them on, for example, iOS. You get more of them in places like Congregate, the Flash game sites, and these sorts of things. Now there are reasons for that, but I think really what this represents is a failure of sorts, in that there's no reason why we can't design large, well-constructed puzzle games. It's just that there are a few problems, and I'll talk about that later. But I think it's a missed opportunity, and we're just beginning to see now sort of a return to puzzle games as a more popular choice for designers, and some very good work is being done. So the future may be bright. So, mentioning Braid earlier, I touched on the idea that it wasn't entirely a puzzle game, and the reason is, of course, it also contains some physical challenges. It's a platformer, your character is jumping around and so forth. Now, this is true of many games, and indeed a lot of video games have no puzzle element at all and are entirely physical challenges. Now, there are some key differences between puzzles and physical challenges in terms of how the players interact with them, which I think are worth highlighting. In particular, we have evolved over thousands and thousands of years to be very good at learning how to overcome physical challenges. And in particular, we can do it by failing. So we try something, we're not very good at it, we try again, we get slightly better, we try again and again and again and so on, and eventually we become good enough to pass the challenge, at which point we feel very pleased with ourselves. And this forms the basis of a lot of the design of arcade games and other games with physical dexterity-based, reaction-based skills in them. The same is not quite true of puzzles. Whilst it's rewarding to solve a puzzle, we don't have this ability to get better at a puzzle just by repeatedly banging our heads against it. It doesn't work like that. And this makes puzzles in some respects harder to design, because you have to think about the mechanisms by which players will eventually overcome these challenges, and indeed whether they can at all, and be very careful about difficulty and establishing the knowledge needed in advance to solve a puzzle and so forth. Talk a bit more about that later. So here we come on to what I think is an actual serious problem in modern design, and I want to tell you to stop doing this. Please stop adding puzzles to everything. That's not at all the same as saying don't make puzzle games. So I'll explain what I'm getting at here. Is, I suppose you have a game which, perhaps you have a story or a theme, or perhaps it's an exploration game, or you have some game there, and you're looking at your game and thinking, this thing here, it's a bit light on gameplay. Maybe I should add a few puzzles. And so you make the player collect a key before they can go through a door, and you make them push some crates around, because everybody loves to push things around, don't they? And you make them, I don't know, rotate a statue to reveal a secret passage, and it's all classic stuff. But are you, when you do this, are you really adding anything at all to your game? Is there anything about these frankly mediocre puzzles which people actually welcome? Would your game be better if you didn't do it? Or, if you're not going to add these sorts of puzzles, what can you do instead? Well, I'll come to that in a minute, but the first step is stop doing it. If some puzzle that you're about to add is not interesting enough to stand on its own as a separate game, if you wouldn't play it if it was a web game, for example, or something of that nature, then don't include it at all because the chances are that nobody really wants it there. Puzzles killed gameplay. Very tabloid headline, but really this is the problem. Is once you start designing in a manner where you view gameplay as just one aspect of your game, which might need adjusting or even improving in some way, and you view puzzles as part of a toolbox you might use to achieve that, then what you have is a situation where the process of designing a game isn't the process of building outwards from your gameplay. You're instead creating a grab bag of disparate elements. And gameplay inevitably suffers in this process because actually designing games is hard. And it's hard in the sense that most of the game designs that even a good designer comes up with will be quite weak. And so finding a good design and building a game around that are at the heart of what game design really is. And if you start building a game and you think you're going to fix the gameplay later by adding a light dusting of puzzles or whatever, you're wrong. And the games that we see which have been designed in that way, and we see quite a lot of them, I don't want to name names, but this is a very common practice, are not really very playable. And so we end up in the strange situation where we have thousands and thousands and thousands of games, far more than we could ever play, and yet at the same time, when as players we want to find something to play, we can't find anything we want, and nothing we're interested in. So, unless you live in a very deep hole, you will have noticed in, maybe across the last 5 years or so, a sort of bun fight taking place within the world of gaming concerning a particular kind of game. Now it's a measure of how bad this bun fight has been that I don't even have a good label for this category of games, but they're variously called things like interactive experiences, story games, or even NotGames, which is a kind of almost a humorous response to the way that some of their critics say that they're not games at all. So what are these games? Well, they're games which are missing what we would classically have thought of as gameplay. So no kind of shooting aliens, no jumping around, no solving fiendish puzzles or whatever. And for some reason this has been perceived as a problem by some of their critics, and who say, whoa, we can't be having this, where's the gameplay? And they feel as though they're somehow being well, perhaps not ripped off, because it depends on the price, but that they're being deceived somehow, and this is an unwelcome thing. But actually, I'm inclined to view these games the other way. I think they're solving a long-standing problem in a very clever way, which is, if they want to have a game which is about story or exploration or something of that kind, they make the game they want to make, and then they stop. They don't feel a need to add completely extraneous puzzles, or to staple a first-person shooter to their setting so that you wander around this beautiful world shooting people to give you something to do. So this is a very welcome trend from my perspective, and long may it continue. The strange thing is that I think that if these games had been sprinkled with mediocre puzzles, their critics would have been much happier. Not because they like the puzzles, or even because they would then want to play the game, but because it enables them to say, well, this is just a bad game, and to quietly dismiss it, and not have to worry about what it represents. So I want to take this idea a little bit further, and in order to illustrate this point, I've made up a game. I haven't actually made this game, it's just I wanted to not use a real example here. Because if I used a real example, you'd come in with preconceptions based on perhaps having played it or knowing something about it. So, yes, Hero Frog and Princess Ninja. It sounds like a great story, I'm sure you'll agree. And here at the bottom we've got some controls for running around and doing video game things, whatever it is you do in video games. And classically, we would think about this in terms of messing around with the controls is your gameplay, and then this business at the top here is your story. That makes good sense. But the question I want to raise in your minds is it necessarily the case that all this hammering on keys and so forth is your gameplay? It is for many existing games, but if the design of this game is primarily built around the story, then we've talked about how games with no kind of jumping and shooting and what have you can be perfectly good games. So if you have a game which has both of these elements, is it necessarily the case that the gameplay is all the key manipulation and so forth, the challenges to your dexterity or the puzzles or whatever? Now you might say, but wait a minute, that's the definition of gameplay. But is it, and if it is, should it be? It doesn't necessarily make much sense. I think it makes more sense to think of gameplay as such as being whatever the focus of the game is, the reason why the player wants to play it in the first place. And some games, these various elements slot together very nicely and form a very coherent whole. And in the cases where that happens, do we really want to forcibly separate them and say that bit is the gameplay, that bit is the story? In terms of understanding what makes games good, I'm not sure this is a very good idea. So I have a quote here that I like, which I'll read out to you. If you make people think they're thinking, they'll love you. But if you really make them think, they'll hate you. And it's by this guy, Don Marquis, who unfortunately was not a game developer. He was a journalist and author, lived quite some time ago. Never saw a video game. But I think this quote is quite relevant, particularly to puzzle design, because there is this problem with puzzles that if you're not careful, they can feel like work. And this quote highlights both what can go wrong and what you're aiming for. You're aiming to give this sense of achievement. The feeling of solving a puzzle is good, and the feeling of being unable to solve a puzzle is maybe not so good. So when we start thinking about the relationship between challenge and the rewards that players get out of things, inevitably we start thinking about some of the recent trends in casual game design, and to some extent things like Facebook games, free-to-play games. Some of these games have made a bad name for themselves, and I think that there are sometimes cases where designers look down their nose at these games rather unfairly. I suggest that in fact casual games are in some sense at the cutting edge of game design. And I'll explain why. It's because they are solving the hardest problem, which is if you were designing a so-called hardcore game, then you can put in very difficult physical challenges, and this feedback loop I talked about earlier, whereby people gradually improve and then they overcome the challenge and they get this great sense of achievement. In some sense, that does some of your design for you. You have your reward built in right there, and that's not to say it's trivial to design such games. But there's a sort of template sitting there for you, waiting for you to find the right mechanics. Similarly with the more difficult puzzle games, is if you can find a framework within which you can design interesting puzzles, then you can challenge the player, they overcome that challenge with great difficulty perhaps, and then they get their reward. With casual games, the contract with the player is a little different, as perhaps you've got someone who's got a very difficult work day, and they come home and they're kind of exhausted, and they microwave a pizza or whatever, and perhaps they've got some household chores to do, and they sit down. They've got an hour to play games, and this is going to be perhaps their one relaxation of the day. They don't want to sit down and immediately be faced with a puzzle which stops them short. I mean, it's going to feel like an extension of their workday. So the idea of a casual game is you're entertaining people, and that's at the heart of what games are anyway. So casual games that, they're doing the hard part, but without any of the shortcut tools which some other types of game perhaps have available. And on this basis, I think that casual game designers face the hardest task and have the most potential to be exploring techniques which could be much more widely used outside the sphere of casual games. We could learn a lot from them. And this, of course, is not to say that all casual games are good. Very far from it, but there are some excellent ones, and we certainly shouldn't overlook them, or the techniques that they use. So assuming you broadly accept my claim that you shouldn't just be sprinkling puzzles into everything, what you might do is to then arrive at the question, does my game want puzzles? And start actually thinking about this. This is still not really a very good approach, because here's the problem. If you're asking, does my game want puzzles, you have an existing conception of your game. And what you're asking is still whether you should add puzzles to some existing design. What you should actually be asking is my game a puzzle? Is the core of my game, the essential idea that I'm trying to build, is it inherently a puzzle? Is that its nature? And the picture on the screen here is it's a screenshot from World of Goo, and this game I think is a perfect example of a game that wants to be a puzzle. It has this very neat core mechanic. If you haven't played it, go and take a look at it. It's worth your time. But this mechanic could have been used to make other kinds of games, but inherently it lends itself to puzzles, and recognizing that is a key step in the design of what the game became. And the same may be true of your game. But ask yourself that question, is my game a puzzle? But don't start with something else and then add them. It's not a good way to think about these things. So I want to move on a bit now and talk about actual puzzle design, and then maybe look at a few case studies, that sort of thing. This game here is Sokoban, which is a very old game. It's a box pushing game, and really the one that kicked off an entire subgenre involving pushing objects around on a Cartesian grid. It's actually very well made. The levels are well designed. One interesting thing I found whilst researching this talk is there's quite a lot of web versions of this game which for the most part have designed their own levels, and some of the level design is absolutely terrible. In fact, at one point I had a slide with a level from one of these variants, and was just planning to pull apart the design and criticise it, and then I realised that was kind of a bit rude. I'd feel very uncomfortable if the designer ran across it. But the point is, level design, as we tend to call it, is as important, if not more important, than the design of your core mechanics. And I realised that actually this distinction needs to be made. Is when we think of puzzle games, we often think first of their mechanics. They sort of define the game for us. But a mechanic is the property of the game itself. But what makes something a puzzle is not the mechanics. There's really no such thing at all as a puzzle mechanic. Puzzles are a thing you can do with mechanics. And certainly some mechanics lend themselves more to puzzles, others don't. But something is a puzzle when you put together a particular situation for the player to solve using whatever mechanics you may have. So, rules discovery gameplay. What is it? It's the design technique where instead of explaining to your player all the rules of your puzzle game and then allowing them to solve levels using the rules you've explained, you just instead drop them into a level and design the game itself in such a way that they will be able to learn the rules of the game through play. This is a very nice technique, and the game that you see on the screen here is a game by Stephen Lavelle, who you might know better as Ingrapari. It has the rather unfortunate title of Puzzles, but it's available free online, and I do recommend that you play it if you haven't already. The first level of this game is perhaps the perfect example of how to use this technique. Rules discovery gameplay has many advantages. You don't have to write a tutorial. It can be enjoyable for the player to discover the rules, the process of discovery itself. But it does have some downsides, particularly if used incautiously. So the risk, what might go wrong, is that if you tell the player all the rules of a puzzle and then they get a bit stuck, they at least have something to think about. They can sit there and think, okay, this is what I know, and they can work forward in gradual systematic steps. If you put the player in a situation where they have to discover the rules and they get stuck, that might be it. They might have nothing that they can think about, no systematic way to progress forward, and that might be the end of their interactions with your game entirely if they can come up with no way to progress. Good design will get you out of this to a large extent, but on the other hand, that's not very useful advice. Like, do good design. Yes, I think you were probably going to try and do that anyway, so just be aware of this pitfall, and as with many things in game design, good playtesting can be invaluable in warning you if you've run into this problem. So a somewhat similar approach is strategy discovery gameplay. What do I mean by this? It's a situation where you do present the player with all the rules, but some of the techniques that arise from these rules, some of the implications of them, are far from obvious, and as the player progresses through your game, it falls to them to discover and exploit these more powerful techniques as they slowly get better at the game. And this approach has the advantage that it does get around the problem with rules discovery. The player will never be truly stuck in terms of not being able to access the techniques that they need. But again, there is a downside, and in this case the downside is you have to predict the player's learning rate. And of course there isn't even a correct answer to that because different players learn at different rates. So it makes the design of the progression between levels quite difficult to get right, and to some degree you have to accept that that pacing will then be wrong for some of your players and find ways to keep them interested, or as the case may be, to get them past obstacles. So this slide arose out of a Rock Paper Shotgun article by Marsh Davies that came out in January this year called How to Make a Good Puzzle Game. It's a lovely piece actually. It's sort of a group interview almost with Alan Hazelden, the designer of Soccerbond, and Jonathan Whiting, who's perhaps best known for Sports Friends recently, but has done all kinds of little things, including a collaboration with Alan, and Jonathan Blow, who's pretty well known in the indie circles at least, and designed Braid amongst other things, currently working on The Witness. They had all kinds of interesting things to say, and for the most part I agree with them, so I'm going to pick on the one thing I don't agree with, which is a comment that was made that really the appeal of puzzle games lies in learning the game and mastering its techniques rather than solving particular puzzles. Now, there's nothing wrong with enjoying the process of learning, but the difficulty here is that this doesn't leave any room for the players playing the game to enjoy the process of mastering it. So in particular, if you have a situation where every level you are introducing some new technique which the player has to learn, then the result of that is that at the start of every level the player is off balance and they don't know what they're doing and they can't solve the problem, and they have this hurdle to overcome which often will feel after a few levels like really hard work. It's just solid obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, and I don't think that's actually very good pacing. Now the title of this slide doesn't match up with the graph. It's a brilliant slide design on my part. What this graph shows is the way that I think things ought to work, which is you allow the player's confidence to gradually increase tackling a sequence of problems where they do in fact know how to tackle the problem, because you are not introducing new techniques and you are not undermining their ability to use what they've already learned. And then, you're presenting harder and harder examples, of course. The challenge level is increasing, but increased challenge doesn't necessarily undermine the player's experience of knowing what they're doing. And then once you've given them a reasonably hard example of one thing, then you introduce a new technique and we're back to learning, and the player is once again off balance, and they start with what's perhaps an easier example of some new technique, and then you repeat the process again. I think for the most part this is a better way to structure puzzle games, because to start with, it gives the player a decent sense of reward. They're not just learning things, they're learning things and then being allowed to apply them, being given the space to apply them. Secondly, some puzzles, actually complex examples are really interesting, and if you have to introduce a new thing with every level, you never get to build complex examples because they would be overwhelming, and I think that's a loss. It's an opportunity you don't want to miss. Okay, so a very specific case study here. This is Lemmings, the original Amiga classic from back in the 80s. And it's one very particular level as well. This level, Postcard from Lemmingland, is an excellent piece of design in my opinion. Now, it's actually quite a long way through the game. It's somewhere around almost 3/4 of the way through the game. And yet it's a very simple level. If you don't know Lemmings, the way the game works is you can assign particular roles to these little creatures that wander around, and each role is like a tool in a toolbox, and you use them to solve puzzles. This particular level, you have very few of these, so your toolkit is very simple, and having by this point accumulated quite a lot of experience of the game, the player will have one of two experiences. Either they will say, oh, well, this is a very straightforward level, they will just complete it immediately, or they will have the experience that I had and become immediately stuck, and then puzzled as to how they could possibly be stuck on such a simple level, because not only is the toolkit simple, but the geometry of this level is very simple. There's just a sort of a wall and a pit, and the exit is right there, and how can you possibly not solve it? Well, what's going on here is that this level is an advanced tutorial in the form of a simple level design, and there is a technique the player needs to use to solve it. So in Lemmings, if one of your lemmings is building a bridge and they build a bridge into an obstacle, they will stop building and turn round, which makes perfectly good sense, and you will encounter this quite early. Equally, another rule of the game, which the player will be well familiar with by this point, is that if a lemming is doing anything and you assign it a new role, it will stop doing the previous thing that it was doing. Now, the way to solve this particular level is very simple. You need to use a technique where one of your lemmings is walking along, you get it to dig a hole vertically down, and long before it's finished, when it's only dug a short way, you then switch to building a bridge. The combined effect of this is that the lemming will build a bridge into the side of its own hole, turn round and head back the way that it came. It's a very simple technique, and it's essential, absolutely essential for some of the later levels of the game. So what this particular level does is it forces the player to know this technique before they proceed. And the simplicity of the level design is how it accomplishes this, because there are so few tools and the design is so simple that even if the player has no idea about this technique, as I didn't, they will discover it through this level, and then they will go on and be able to enjoy the later part of the game. So, Colossal Cave. This is one of the earliest text adventures. It dates all the way back to the mid-70s, and I just wanted to talk about one particular puzzle in this game, which I think is quite clever. You find yourself in a maze, and in fact, the text for this maze has become moderately famous on the internet. You are in a twisty maze of passageways, all alike. A lot more people will recognise this quote than have ever actually played the game. So this particular maze is very difficult to get out of, the reason being that all of the rooms are identical, and because this is a text adventure, In fact, you can't even work out where you are within the maze by the sequence of moves that you've made, because if you go north from one room, you don't necessarily enter the next room from the south. They connect up in a completely arbitrary way. So this presents you with a problem. You could just do it by trial and error, but with a fairly large number of rooms in the maze, your chances of getting out in any reasonable time frame are very low. It's not a good strategy. So the way out is quite clever. What you do is you take objects from your inventory and you put them down on the floor. And by doing this, you put a different object in each room that you visit, you're able to recognise rooms that you've been in before by the object that's in the middle of the floor. And if you have a sufficiently large number of objects, then you can map a way out of the maze, and once you know the route, you can come back and pick up all the objects again. So why is this a particularly clever problem? Well, what's clever about it is that the mechanic which enables you to pick up and drop objects is really there for an entirely different purpose. It's because you need objects in your adventure, and this is the way that you carry them around. So by the time the player encounters this problem, this maze that is, they're well familiar with the technique that they need to solve it in terms of the mechanics involved. But it's a leap of lateral thinking to realise that they can use this mechanic as a maze-solving technique. It's very far from obvious. In fact, actually, it's so not obvious that it could be argued that this puzzle is too hard. The only reason I wouldn't argue that is because actually it's one of the easiest puzzles in the game. Colossal Cave is fiendishly difficult. So if you ask people what their favourite puzzle game is, lots of players will mention Portal. Portal, actually, mechanically speaking, is mostly like a first-person shooter, except that you don't shoot enemies. I mean, there are enemies, but you don't shoot them. And then it has this one additional mechanic, which is the portal gun. You place these two holes, an orange and a purple hole, a little like the portable hole from Yellow Submarine or wherever it was, and if you go through one, you come out the other. So this turns out to have lots of implications. Okay, but it's got this clever mechanic. The interesting thing about Portal is that, in some sense, it's actually only got 2 puzzles in it. Which, you know, it's not a very short game, so it may seem like a surprising claim. But what's going on is that this only becomes apparent when you've completed the whole game. It's the perspective that you have as you look back on what you've been doing. And if you play it through a second time, it will become very clear. And the 2 puzzles being, firstly, the portal gun enables you to connect points in space. So the question is, which point shall I connect in order to make my way through the level, through the landscape? And then the only other puzzle is, where can I get some momentum? Because you realise that portal gun violates conservation of energy and allows you to throw things around. And that's it. But having only 2 puzzles turns out to be more than enough, and it makes for a very entertaining game. So this is interesting because if you're designing a game and you start off with your mechanic and you think, well, what can I do with this mechanic? There doesn't have to be an enormous depth of puzzles for a mechanic to be good. In fact, if you look at Portal 2, it has a great many more mechanics, but I would argue it's not a better game by any means. In fact, the single-player mode of Portal 2 is really quite chaotic. It certainly has none of the elegance of the original. So although most of these case studies are more about puzzle design than anything else, I wanted to briefly come back to this idea about gameplay that we were talking about earlier and talk about Monument Valley. So this is a lovely little game, it's an iOS game. When it came out, it was interesting to me to read some of the commentary on it, with some players complaining that it was too short and too easy. Now, these are both criticisms of games that are levelled from time to time at various things. But in the case of Monument Valley, I think there's an interesting thing that might be going on. This game is very pretty, and it's arguably like an interactive version of the art of M.C. Escher. There's some very interesting experiments going on with visual perception and geometry and what have you. So I was thinking about the puzzles and thinking, was this just a decision to make a casual game? But I began to wonder if there was more to it, because really the point of Monument Valley as a thing is it has this beautiful art. And so maybe what's going on here is that the puzzles are not there so much to provide really tough obstacles, to provide a challenge to the player, but it's to solve a problem that you get in art galleries, where if you see somebody walking through an art gallery, they will stop, for a few seconds in front of each picture and then move quickly on to look at the next ones, and then eventually they're done and they go off and get a cup of coffee or whatever. But perhaps the interactivity in Monument Valley, the main purpose is to get the player interacting with the art, so they're actually appreciating what's been built here. And there's quite sophisticated level design, and sure, maybe the game is a little on the easy side compared to some puzzle games, but that may be a feature, not a bug. The idea is just for the player to proceed through and enjoy what they're experiencing. Repton 2 and Riven. So, in the live version of this talk, I challenged the audience to say what it was that these two games had in common, and they very quickly spotted that the correct answer was they both begin with a capital R. So that was helpful. In fact, there's another thing they have in common, which is that they're both sequels to successful puzzle games. Repton was on the old BBC Micro, a very good puzzle game. Repton 2 is a similar thing again. They're both a little like Boulder Dash, or whatever example of that subgenre you're familiar with. The change was that Repton 2 joins up all the levels into a single giant world, and there are some puzzles, in fact most of the puzzles, span the world. And similarly with Riven, it's a sequel to Myst, which had largely localized puzzles, and Riven expands those puzzles out to span a fairly large game world. And in both cases, I think this actually undermines the gameplay quite a bit, because the player sits there largely paralysed, unsure what to do next, and they've got this vast task ahead of them and no way to know how to begin. And I wonder if what happened here is that these world-spanning puzzles are really fun to design, and so this approach is appealing to the designer but doesn't necessarily work for the player. And this reminded me of another point from the Rock Paper Shotgun article I mentioned earlier, Marsh Davies' article, where the point was made that designing puzzles has some similarities with solving puzzles. And I think what this example demonstrates is that although there are similarities, it's also important to recognise the differences, and there's pitfalls there if you're not careful. Things which are fun to design but are not fun to play. So I wanted to briefly mention undo. I think it's a pretty much essential feature of most puzzle games that they allow players to undo moves. The reason being that otherwise you end up wasting a huge amount of the player's time. So if you have a level which takes, say, 5 minutes to complete if you know what you're doing, the player could easily make 2, 3, 4 minutes worth of moves, realise they've made a mess, and then have to start again. It could take them 20 minutes to finish your level, which isn't really okay. So this is quite widely known. Undo is good. It can be a bit tedious to implement, particularly if you're not really a programmer. But there is a problem with undo, which is seldom discussed, which is that for certain kinds of puzzle game, there is hidden information in the world, and undo then causes a problem. And if you've seen the Bill Murray film, Groundhog Day, it causes a problem for exactly that reason. In this film, Bill Murray solves all the problems in his life by approaching them again and again and again with the knowledge of what happened as a result of his previous approach. And with a game like, for example, Minesweeper, if you try marking a particular square, exploring a particular square, it turns out to have a mine on it and you lose. If you can then go back in time via the undo button and mark differently, then of course you won't click on that mine and you'll then win, so that's no good at all. And the game shown on the slide here is Hex Cells Infinite, which has an interesting approach to this problem in that it allows you to make errors without losing, but it keeps a count of your errors, and then at the end of the level, provided that your errors are under a certain count, you still pass. And it tracks these across levels so that if you have one bad level it doesn't stop you, but you'll have to compensate for it by being a bit better on the next level. Now, I describe this as an approach to the problem, not a solution, because it doesn't really solve it. It's kind of unsatisfying to play. But I think it's about as well as you can do. So this is the thing, is that the necessity of having undo limits which mechanics you can use. And it's something to bear in mind early in the design of a puzzle game, that undo is an important requirement for your game, but if you can't implement it, you have to think about how annoying that's going to be for the player, and how many compromises you'll have to make to get the game working without it. Puzzles we mostly think of as having designed levels, hand-designed levels, but a lot of other types of game which are not really puzzle games have puzzle-like elements in them, and I want to talk briefly about collectible card games, because from my perspective these are very like a sort of roguelike puzzle game, using roguelike here in the rather odd modern sense of meaning programmatically generated. This is because typical board states in these games get very, very complex, and there's some set of moves which must necessarily exist, which is the perfect play in each situation, but players don't always find them, they're difficult to find, and so this is in effect like a puzzle. But interestingly, it's a puzzle which the player won't necessarily solve. If they solve it, it won't win them the game, or not in general, it'll give them some small advantage. If they fail to solve it, they'll be correspondingly set back. But by presenting a sequence of such puzzles, players who are good at solving them will end up getting an advantage. And so, in a sense, CCG matches are really very like puzzle games, and they use similar sets of skills to solve. This is Valkyria Chronicles. This is a very nice little PS3 game. Essentially a war game in the style of something like Advance Wars or Battle Isle. But it's got a strong story element as well, which is well integrated with the battles. It feels like part of the same game. This causes an interesting problem. So there's this one particular mission where halfway through the mission, and it's quite a long mission, these two enemy tanks appear and ambush you. And from a story perspective, this works very well. It's a dramatic moment. If this was a film, it would be a very successful scene. In a game of this type, it causes a serious problem because the player has been carefully planning their moves thus far, and the appearance of these tanks will ruin their plan. Which is fine, except that in a reasonably well-balanced game like this, it will cause the player to lose. They then have to go back, but they can't simply undo, they can't simply reload a recent position, because their strategy will have been wrong all the way through. They never knew these tanks were going to turn up. So what they instead have to do is restart the entire mission. So again, it's another instance of really the player's time is just being wasted, and when that happens, that's not okay. You can't really do this. Why this case is interesting is because it was done for a good reason. This was in service of the story, but it illustrates that when you have story considerations like this, you still can't exercise a free hand. You have to keep one eye on what the player's gameplay experience is going to be like, and if necessary, exercise restraint and not do this kind of thing. This game is Dynasty Tactics 2 on the PlayStation 2. I actually really love this game. It's also an unusual central mechanic which it has. Again, it's a war game like Valkyria Chronicles, set in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms mythology in China. The actual battles are in some ways not like battles at all, they're like puzzles, and the reason why is how special powers on units work in this game. Is if you activate a unit's special power, then if the area of effect of any other unit's powers intersect with the one you activated, they automatically go off, and this process continues right across the battlefield until there are no more to activate. Each additional one you add to the sequence gives you a damage multiplier, and so this is in fact how you win battles. You're trying to set up these big long sequences, and if you just fight fair, you won't win. It's just not possible. So really every level is like a little puzzle, except not precisely designed by the game's creators. They emerge partly as a result of moves on the battlefield by both you and the opponent. It's a very interesting way to generate situations worth thinking about. So we've talked a few times about games that mix physical challenges with puzzles. These games can work very well, but there's a problem which arises which is worth highlighting. Just suppose you have a game where And this example shown on the slide here is Cube, which is quite a successful game. I think it may have been the first one backed by Indie Fund. It plays very well. The problem which arises is you can find yourself in a situation as a player where you're stuck, and it can be unclear to you as a player whether you are stuck because you have failed to solve a problem or because there is some physical obstacle that you need to overcome which you are failing to overcome. So suppose, for example, that you're faced by some jump and you attempt the jump and you fall short. Is that because you didn't do the jump quite well enough? Or is it because you need to solve some puzzle which will give you a slightly longer jump range somehow, or even jump from a different point, or make some very fundamental change to the space you're in which will allow you to complete it in a completely different way? And it's difficult to know which of these options applies, but unlike a pure puzzle where you can think about all the rules you know and reason out your options, if you're stuck on a physical challenge, nothing can provide you with the certainty that that is what's holding you back. And so you might attempt this jump 10, 20, 100 times and be failing, but still not be sure if it's possible or if it's actually not possible at all. Where puzzles are concerned, I think a good rule is if a player is stuck on a puzzle, they ought to have something to think about. Because being stuck doesn't have to be frustrating as long as the process of thinking about how to get unstuck is itself interesting and entertaining. And in the presence of physical puzzles, that condition may be hard to satisfy. Now, right back at the beginning of this talk, I was discussing how one of the features of puzzles is that it takes much longer to find a solution than to implement that solution. This, in fact, is a good thing for another reason, which is that implementing solutions in puzzle games is often less interesting. The player no longer has anything to think about, and in many games the process of implementation is not itself very interesting. The game shown on this slide is one of my own games from all the way back in 1993. It's an Amiga game called Dozer, and it's a puzzle game. This game, for the most part, plays pretty well, but it does suffer from a serious problem, which is that some of the later levels in the game are quite large, and even after solving them, it can take 10 or even 15 minutes to fully implement the solution, and that process is really not fun. So when you're at the stage of designing mechanics and thinking about the way that your game is going to play in practice, it's worth considering this factor. And if it does seem as though solutions might take a tediously long time to implement, think about whether there's any way you can change the gameplay slightly to make it quicker or at least more enjoyable to clear levels once you've solved them. And finally, I just briefly want to mention an issue I've had with my current project. And you may remember Crayon Physics Deluxe, which is the very clever game in which you can draw anything you like with your mouse, and then it sort of comes to life via a physics engine, and the wheels roll and things swing about and so forth. When this game came out, I played through it, and I found it oddly disappointing. And the reason why is that, in my head, I had somehow decided that this was a puzzle game, and that what I would be doing was drawing things to solve puzzles. And to some extent, the game does have this structure. But if you play it as a very purist puzzle game, it doesn't really work. And the reason why is because the game's mechanics are so powerful that actually once you have the basic techniques down, you can solve every remaining level in the game with really no difficulty at all. But reading things written by Petri Purho, the game's creator, it's not really supposed to be played in this way. What you're supposed to be doing is, taking a more sandboxy view and building interesting things, and each of the levels is designed to suggest certain things you could build which might be interesting. And played that way, it works much better. So my current project, King Machine, is a game about building machines. And early in its development, or for quite some time, I found myself drifting towards turning it into a puzzle game. Not all games want to be puzzles, and in fact, I remembered my experiences with Crayon Physics and eventually backed away from this design, heading for a more sandboxy approach, but trying to find other ways of directing what the player was doing, such that each part of the game felt different rather than just one giant freeform sandbox. Okay, some brief conclusions. So, firstly, don't just add puzzles to everything. If puzzles are not a natural part of the design that you're making, they don't belong there at all. If you feel like your gameplay is a bit lightweight, or there's just not enough to your game to attract players to it, go back to your original concept. Think about what it was you wanted to make, and focus on why the design interests you. Chances are it will interest players for the same reason. Secondly, in terms of what makes a good puzzle, the process of solving puzzles is really just the process of thinking about things. So if you come across things which are interesting to think about, that's a good basis for a puzzle. No puzzle game is going to consist entirely of players progressing smoothly through your levels. There will always be times when the player needs to stop and think. And the measure of a good puzzle game is how enjoyable that process is. Lastly, regarding the Don Marquis quote on one of the earlier slides, you might feel that it's unavoidable that puzzle games are about forcing people to think. But maybe instead what we should be doing, is inviting players to think. And in particular, there is this very harmful stereotype that people are mostly quite stupid. I think in fact the opposite is true. Not only are people generally smarter than we think that they are, they're also smarter than they think they are. And a good puzzle game should show the player what they can do, and the process of discovering what they can do should be an enjoyable and rewarding one. So, thank you for listening, and if you have any questions or you want to chat more about this stuff, then you can tweet at me, that address right there, at FastRamDesign, or if you have slightly more than that to say, then feel free to send me an email, dom@fastram.co.uk. Cheers, goodbye.